The news headlines in the US read like a country experiencing an increasingly violent social collapse. The political divide is obvious and growing wider and more hostile. Both sides are violating the Constitution, which is no longer enforced by the Supreme Court, failing as the primary means to hold the country together. The hostility and hatred are rising, and with evidence of a population that is increasingly eager for or already waging war on the other side. As this short video explains, intelligence agencies' state instability models and data from polls and experts suggest the US has great risk of violence, even some form of civil war. States aren't going to be fighting, but the country faces a very real risk of protests and violence that could spiral out of control and yield a collapse, widespread loss of law and order that opens the door for looting and major casualties. One CEO assassination won't spark a civil war, although one assassination did spark World War I, but it is the tremendous support for a CEO murderer amongst tens of millions of Americans that demonstrates how our society is angry, divided, and eager to fight the other side. Elon Musk dare not venture out in public, and his Tesla cars are increasingly under arson attack. The political and social divide in the US is worsening, increasingly violent, with the president openly defying the Constitution and the judiciary. The Central Intelligence Agency and other organizations have developed models to estimate state instability. I'm a former intelligence officer, served on the headquarters staff in Iraq during what was in effect a civil war, and when you look at instability models, the US does not score well. A state maintains stability when it can enforce laws, change laws in response to social pressure, and has legitimacy, strong public support. Disobeying laws is widespread and commonplace in the US. Even laws like don't murder are not supported by a large percent of the population if the victim is a political enemy. The US can change laws, but the country is so divided that when it does, half the population is pleased, the other half outraged. But the worst instability problem is in the US is legitimacy. The Trump administration is not just openly defying basic principles of the Constitution, violating the law, and ignoring judicial rulings against them. They are flaunting their eagerness to ignore judges and demand their removal. But while Trump opponents condemn his clear violations of the Constitution, Trump's supporters and libertarians counter that constitutional limits to government are effectively gone since the Supreme Court refuses to enforce the 10th Amendment. Federal social, welfare, healthcare, many programs are clearly unconstitutional. Nor does the Supreme Court defend the most important American part of government, limiting government to protect our natural rights. The court allows flagrant violations of individual natural rights protected by the largely ignored Ninth Amendment, like rights to privacy, private property, the right to be left alone. What both sides, almost all Americans, do agree on is that our government is a divisive, corrupt, bad mess, as this Pew Research Center poll shows. On issues like gun control, abortion, social programs, income redistribution, welfare, education, support for the police, and many others, the country is divided, united only by our shared hatred of government politics. In sum, the legitimacy of the US government is gone. Both sides are seeing the other as wrong and unjust, which is what intelligence agency political instability models call a crisis of legitimacy, a society's view that government has lost the right because it is wrong or unjust. The vast majority of US citizens today see our government as corrupt, bad, wrong, unjust. Americans have very good reason to hate government. A recent video outlined 30 documented examples of how our unlimited, unconstitutional government is literally killing citizens with all kinds of unconstitutional programs and policies that help career politicians buy votes and get reelected, but are killing members of the silent majority. Programs that give benefits to special interest groups and key political constituents earn their votes for career politicians who are always running for re-election, but at the expense of not just personal liberty, but often the lives of the silent majority. As this video explains, the deaths number in the tens to hundreds of thousands now, but US citizens have been set up to die by the hundreds of millions in a collapse because of a corrupt, perverted, self-serving system of unconstitutional government. With Doge taking a chainsaw to government, half the country is thrilled and the other half is absolutely opposed. It is obvious that President Trump is not going to unite the country, but increase the divisions and pour gas on the fires. A recent poll of several hundred preppers, people who are looking at the news and watching for threat indications, well-informed people, asked them, do you believe that President Trump's actions and plans to date are increasing or decreasing the likelihood of domestic civil war? The poll found that 50% believe Trump is greatly increasing the likelihood of civil war, with another 20% indicating he is slightly increasing the likelihood of civil war. 7% responded that Trump is not having an impact on the likelihood of civil war, but that a domestic civil war is likely. Combined, 77% of respondents believe Trump is increasing the likelihood of civil war or that domestic civil war is likely. Ray Dalio, the founder of Bridgewater Capital, one of the largest and most successful hedge funds ever, made his fortune by correctly predicting future events. He believes the U.S. Civil War is very likely given the sharp increasing divisions in our society. Now, a second civil war will not be anything like the first with states or armies fighting, but it will be citizen groups fighting within counties and states. To understand how this violence could develop, analysis and simulations were done on the Collapse Survivor app. The U.S. military owes much of its success to realistic training exercises, command post or tabletop exercises that simulate different scenarios that could lead to war. Using input from intelligence officers, analysts, and experts who have studied political instability, the Collapse Survivor app ran several simulations on how domestic political divisions could escalate into protest, violence, and a collapse. The hundreds of people playing the simulations were polled about what kind of violence they expect to result. In a Collapse Survivor app scenario where Trump was reelected, political divisions led to rural conservative counties in California rebelling against the state government controlled by liberal urban Democrats. Political protests and violence evolved into conservative and libertarian citizens revolting against Democratic-controlled state governments in California, Oregon, Nevada, Colorado, Illinois, New York, and Massachusetts. It was not a civil war between states, but civil war within states, with rural conservative counties revolting and often fighting against state gun control laws and then kicking state government officials out of their counties and refusing to follow all kinds of laws, gun control laws, zoning and building code laws, forced by urban-dominated state governments into rural counties that oppose such rules. How the deepening U.S. political divisions evolves is unpredictable, but we have already seen how political protests in the U.S. can lead to loss of law and order, with bad people taking advantage of political protests to start looting. We've seen this in places like Portland, Oregon, and Baltimore and elsewhere. With the growing political divide and violence exacerbated by media and podcaster coverage, with social media often used to incite and organize flash mobs, you can see how the U.S. could suffer widespread, long-lasting political protests, looting, and loss of law and order. Criminals can take advantage of overwhelmed police during political protests to loot and even rob and kill people in their homes. A major training lesson from Collapse Survivor app training exercise simulations is that when police are overwhelmed with protesters, criminals and gang members can exploit this and law and order can quickly vanish. The more important question is how severe and long-lasting the political violence will be. Does it escalate into a collapse where law enforcement is so overwhelmed that law and order vanishes over wide areas, economic activity largely ends, food is not delivered, and society breaks down? This question was addressed by 23 intelligence officers, political scientists, biologists, defense analysts, and scientists in a recent update of the probability of collapse model maintained by Disaster Preparedness and presented at a recent press conference. Experts reviewed 50 disaster trigger events that could spark a collapse, including the high probability of nuclear war, a bioengineered H5N1 pandemic, and civil war risk. The probability of collapse model now estimates a 16 to 57% annual likelihood of a collapse. It's a highly uncertain number, but it is not a low estimate. The model weighs both the probability of the initial trigger disaster event occurring and then the likelihood that that initial disaster disruption spreads and escalates to a collapse level disaster where there's widespread loss of law and order and society breaks down. The top 3 collapse threats, according to the probability of collapse model, are loss of the electric grid, a bad pandemic, and domestic civil war. The model estimated a 2% annual risk of a domestic civil war that leads to a collapse. The likelihood of political violence and looting is much higher than this, but the probability that it escalates to the point of a national collapse is lower. A recent issue of the New Yorker magazine featured Americans preparing for a second civil war. The political instability models note that one seemingly trivial trigger event can ignite a collapse or civil war. The preppers who are watching the trends and conditions, the intelligence agency, state instability models, and Ray Dalio's estimate of a greater than 50% likelihood of civil war are all wise warnings. It won't be a war between battling states, but the nation's divisions are increasing, will get more violent, and some trigger event, like a bad recession or an assassination, or just rising numbers of flash mobs and protests, could lead to a widespread loss of law and order and a collapse that you should be prepared for.